modern superheroes.
Roman stood as a lone figure in the shadowed landscape of Russian justice, a quiet yet fierce hero who chose courage over silence. In a world where corruption and brutality seeped into the walls of every institution, he was a rare voice daring to challenge the monstrous forces at play. The system was one of unchecked power, shrouded in secrecy, a machine that silenced dissent and twisted lives with a single stroke. Yet Roman, with his unwavering conviction, had seen the cruelty firsthand, felt its ruthless grip, and knew he could not look away. Where others turned a blind eye, Roman sharpened his gaze. The stories he heard, the horrors he witnessed, each one became a piece of armor in his relentless battle against oppression. He was not a man who sought glory or recognition. Instead, he was driven by an almost uncontainable need for justice. To him, the fight was worth any sacrifice, no matter how personal or dangerous. For Roman, the cost of silence was simply too high. In Russia, the state's power cast a dark, unyielding shadow over those who dared to question it. Corruption ran deep, as if woven into the very fabric of the system, twisting justice into a tool for silencing voices that spoke against it. Behind closed doors, decisions were made with ruthless efficiency, lives upturned without a second thought. In this oppressive climate, one's existence could be erased, reputations crushed, families shattered, all for the simple crime of seeking truth. For Roman, the journey began with the whispered stories of prisoners and the unspeakable abuses hidden within the prison walls. As he unearthed these horrors, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on him. Driven by an unwavering sense of duty, he started gathering evidence, collecting names, and exposing those who wielded torture as a weapon of control. The danger was real, ever present. His own life became a balancing act between uncovering the truth and protecting himself from the very forces he sought to expose. The threats began almost immediately. Anonymous messages, shadowed figures following him, the sense of being watched, always. Roman knew the risks, but the mission had already taken root in his heart. He was forced into a life of secrecy, moving in silence, communicating in coded messages. And as the threats escalated, so did his resolve. Soon, he would make the hardest decision of all, leaving behind his homeland, his family, everything he knew, for the chance to fight from a place beyond their reach. The journey was only beginning, but the stakes had never been higher. Roman had seen things that most people could never fathom, horrors buried deep within Russia's prison walls. He'd heard the tortured screams echo through the corridors, met those who bore the scars of unimaginable cruelty, and witnessed how corruption festered unchecked, creating a brutal hierarchy that preyed on the vulnerable. Each story he uncovered painted a vivid picture of the darkness lurking behind the scenes, a darkness he couldn't ignore. As he gathered these stories, Roman found himself pulled deeper into a web of danger. Surveillance tightened, threats turned into confrontations, and soon he realized that his relentless pursuit of truth had made him a marked man. Escape became his only option. It was a choice riddled with sacrifice, but he knew he couldn't stop now. Not when he had uncovered so much. France became his refuge, and for the first time, Roman could breathe without fearing the next knock on his door. Here, he stepped into the light, speaking openly about the atrocities he had documented, exposing names, faces, and acts that had long been shrouded in secrecy. His revelations were explosive, the first cracks in a system that thrived on silence and fear. Now, the world was watching, and Roman's story was far from over. Roman grew up in a small town in Russia, where the reality of life was often stark and unkind. From a young age, he saw how people around him, friends, family, neighbors, were held captive by an unyielding system. Corruption wasn't some distant concept, it was woven into the routines of daily life. Authorities ruled with absolute control, and there were unspoken rules everyone followed. Keep your head down, stay silent, and never question the powers that be. Those who did face swift retribution, their lives uprooted, their voices snuffed out. Roman learned these lessons young, yet something inside him rejected the silence that others embraced out of fear. He saw friends pulled into the clutches of corrupt officials, forced to live by rules that made no sense except to keep the powerful in power. Stories circulated about local authorities extorting money, police turning a blind eye to crimes committed by those who could pay their way out. And worse, abuses hidden behind the prison's closed doors. Rumors spread, whispered warnings passed in shadows, telling of the torture inflicted on those who dared resist. And Roman could feel the anger building, a sense of injustice he couldn't shake. The true turning point came when a close friend of his, a kind-hearted, quiet young man with a bright future, was accused of a crime he didn't commit. Roman watched helplessly as this friend was dragged through a twisted judicial process where guilt was decided long before any trial, his innocence irrelevant against the machinery of corruption. His friend was sentenced, locked away, and subjected to the brutal reality Roman had only heard about until then. Seeing the torment in his friend's eyes as he was led away left a scar on Roman's heart, igniting something fierce and unbreakable within him. This, he realized, was the cost of silence. It was then that Roman made a promise to himself, a vow to expose the truth, to give a voice to those who had none, and to bring justice, however small, to a system built to crush it. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers he couldn't fully imagine. But he knew that he could no longer stand by, not while countless others suffered in silence. This was the beginning of Roman's journey, the spark that would set his life on an irreversible path toward justice, no matter the cost. Fueled by his promise to fight for those trapped in silence, Roman knew he had to find a way to reach beyond the walls of fear and control. Traditional paths were closed, open protests were quickly crushed, media was tightly controlled, and any form of direct confrontation was dangerous. But he saw an opportunity in the digital shadows, a space where the state's reach wasn't absolute. And so, the idea of a digital resistance was born. Roman created a Telegram channel, naming it Anti-Torture. On the surface, it seemed simple, a platform where stories could be shared, messages sent. But he knew its potential was powerful. This channel would be more than just a collection of words. It would become a lifeline for those trapped in Russia's oppressive system, a place where truth could be laid bare without the risk of immediate retribution. Slowly, carefully, Roman began reaching out. At first, only a few voices responded, each whispering their stories with fear and caution. But as he published these accounts, anonymous yet vivid, the channel began to gain traction. Stories poured in. Accounts of prisoners beaten into silence, of guards who turned violence into a twisted sport, of inmates who had witnessed horrors and survived to tell of them. The movement grew as others began to share their own stories, seeing in the channel a place to unburden, to finally speak truths they had buried deep. To protect his sources, Roman built a network of secure communication, encrypting every message, protecting identities, and taking every measure he could to shield those who dared to share their stories. The risks were immense. Each day, the possibility of exposure loomed, but he kept going, knowing that this work mattered. Each story shared was a small rebellion against the system, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of power. As the channel grew, Roman realized he wasn't just telling stories. He was building a movement, a force strong enough to rattle those who thought they could act with impunity. People began to talk about anti-torture in whispers, as if it were a secret beacon in a dark world. The channel became a place of hope, a source of strength for those who had lived through the worst and still had the courage to speak. And for Roman, it was proof that change was possible, even if it meant working from the shadows. As the anti-torture channel grew, so did the weight of Roman's work. Every story he shared, every name he exposed, pushed him deeper into the dangerous underbelly of the state's power, a place where secrets weren't just hidden, but guarded with brutal force. The risks weren't just his own. With every step he took against the system, he knew he was putting his family in harm's way as well. It was a constant, heavy reminder of the price of his mission. Roman's family had always been his foundation, a source of warmth and strength. But now, they were also his greatest vulnerability. He had to hide much of his work from them, sparing them details of his relentless fight to avoid dragging them into the shadows that surrounded him. But despite his efforts, they sensed the danger. Conversations became tense, every knock at the door brought a shiver of dread, and the unspoken truth loomed between them, that Roman's work could bring them harm, even though they had no part in it. He saw the fear in their eyes, the worry that hung over them. Late at night, he'd catch his mother's anxious glances, his siblings' hushed whispers about the latest report or disappearance they'd heard of in the news. Each time, he questioned if he was doing the right thing, if his fight was worth the pain and fear he was inflicting on the people he loved most. Yet, even as doubt gnawed at him, he couldn't stop. He couldn't close his eyes to the suffering he knew was happening, not while he had the means to shed light on it. Living a double life took its toll. Roman became a man of two worlds, one in which he was a son, a brother, a friend, pretending that everything was fine, and the other as a lone warrior, exposing the worst of society's hidden cruelties. His days were filled with carefully crafted lies, his nights with anxiety over the security of his communications, and the constant fear that the people closest to him might be caught in the crossfire. Friends he had once trusted drifted away, sensing the gravity of his hidden life. Relationships strained and then broke under the weight of secrets too dangerous to share. It wasn't just the fear and secrecy that wore him down. It was the isolation. Roman had chosen a path that only a few could understand. The anti-torture channel connected him to others, but these were voices of the wounded, voices that reminded him of the pain he was trying to fight, not the solace he craved. In the quiet moments, he wrestled with loneliness, haunted by the realization that he might lose his family, his friends, and everything he held dear in this pursuit. Yet even as he faced these personal sacrifices, Roman remained resolute. He knew that turning back now would mean betraying those who had entrusted him with their stories, who had risked everything to speak out through his platform. His family was his heart, his foundation, but he understood that some battles had to be fought even at a personal cost. This work had become a part of him, a purpose that demanded everything he had, even if it meant walking alone. Despite the heavy toll of his work, Roman's efforts began to yield powerful results. Through the anti-torture channel, stories that had once been whispered in the dark now reached thousands, each voice adding weight to a cause that refused to be silenced. Bit by bit, the secrets Roman exposed started to stir outrage among the community. People who had once turned a blind eye began to feel the impact of these hidden truths, each revelation chipping away at the carefully crafted facade of power the authorities had constructed. And in those cracks, Roman found his first victories. One of his earliest successes came when he uncovered the case of a young man imprisoned on fabricated charges, beaten and humiliated until his spirit was almost broken. The anti-torture channel brought his story to the public, and outrage followed swiftly. People in Roman's town, once fearful of speaking out, started questioning the fairness of the local justice system. They demanded answers from the officials who once acted without question or consequence. For the first time, they saw that they weren't alone in their anger, that they too had a voice. Local news outlets, sensing the story's power, began to report on the case, amplifying the pressure. Eventually, the authorities were forced to drop the charges, and the young man was released. It was a small but significant victory, a moment that showed people that change, however slow, was possible. Encouraged, Roman continued his work, digging deeper into other cases. In another instance, he exposed a network of local officials who extorted money from prisoners' families, promising better treatment for their loved ones in exchange. Families who had suffered in silence finally found the courage to come forward, sharing their experiences, adding fuel to a fire that was becoming impossible to ignore. With growing support from the community, Roman's channel shone a spotlight on this corrupt scheme, drawing the attention of higher authorities. Investigations were opened, and several officials were removed from their positions. These victories didn't just bring justice, they inspired a sense of unity. In the past, fear had divided people, each afraid to speak out alone. But Roman's work had given them a rallying point, a way to feel strong together, to know that their voices mattered. Community leaders reached out, offering to support his cause, and young people in particular looked up to him, seeing in his defiance a glimmer of hope for a future free from the chains of corruption. But with each win, Roman drew the gaze of more dangerous enemies. His victories had turned heads, and the system's loyalists began to see him as a genuine threat. The same people who had once dismissed him now paid attention, their eyes fixed on his every move. Unmarked cars idled outside his home. Officials whispered his name in government offices, and rumors spread that he was on a list of individuals marked for observation. Roman knew he was treading on thin ice. Each story he exposed was a direct challenge to the power that had ruled unchallenged for years. Yet, in the face of these threats, Roman remained undeterred. The community's response gave him strength. Their support was a testament to the impact of his work. He was no longer alone in this fight. His victories belonged to everyone who believed in his cause, everyone who refused to accept a life lived in fear. The risks were mounting, but so was the hope that real change could be achieved, one story at a time. As Roman's influence grew, so did the attention of those who thrived within the very system he sought to dismantle. What had begun as a quiet, almost invisible mission was now impossible for the authorities to ignore. His victories, though small, were chipping away at a system built on silence and submission. Roman's work was more than a nuisance. It was a direct threat to those in power, and they decided it was time to take action. At first, the pressure was subtle. Roman noticed his phone line would suddenly go dead mid-conversation. Strange clicks and silences punctuating even his most mundane calls. Messages took longer to send, if they sent at all, and his friends would mention calls they never received. It was clear that his communications were being monitored. Officials wanted him to know he was being watched, a quiet reminder that he was no longer under the radar. Then came the personal threats. Anonymous messages began appearing in his inbox, each one a thinly veiled warning, reminding him of the reach and power of the people he was up against. Some threats were directed at him, graphic descriptions of what would happen if he continued his work. Others were aimed at his family, chilling reminders that his loved ones could be caught in the crossfire. These threats hit their mark. Roman would lie awake at night, replaying the words in his mind, feeling the crushing weight of responsibility and fear. But he couldn't bring himself to stop. Every threat only fueled his resolve, hardening his will against the forces trying to silence him. As the channel continued to grow, so did the aggression from officials. His home was searched more than once, police arriving under the guise of routine checks, sifting through his belongings, probing for any reason to arrest him. They scrutinized his computer, his phone, every scrap of paper he owned, looking for evidence that would justify shutting him down. Roman knew it was only a matter of time before they found a reason to act. He had crossed a line that few dared to cross, and the authorities would not tolerate his defiance much longer. One day, Roman noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street from his home, its occupants sitting quietly, watching. He would see the same car following him to the market, parked outside his gym, always close but never close enough to confront. It was an unspoken message. They could find him anytime, anywhere. The surveillance was constant, a looming presence that never allowed him a moment's peace. Friends and acquaintances began to distance themselves, fearful of being associated with him. Some whispered warnings, urging him to leave while he still could. Others cut ties completely, wary of the consequences that followed someone like Roman. Still, the authorities escalated further. They began targeting the people who supported him, intimidating those who had shared stories or had provided information for his channel. They leaned on his contacts, questioning them, pressuring them to turn on him. Some were brought in for questioning, held for hours without explanation, forced to endure threats and intimidation. Roman's work was no longer just his own burden. It had spread, enveloping anyone brave enough to stand by him. But Roman understood the game they were playing. Each act of intimidation was a move to wear him down, to isolate him, to make him feel like his cause was hopeless. They wanted him to retreat, to give up the fight and fall back into the silence that kept their power intact. Yet, even as the pressure mounted, Roman refused to be broken. His resolve only deepened, his conviction growing stronger with every threat, every attempt to shut him down. He knew he was on borrowed time, that each day brought him closer to a confrontation he might not walk away from. But the truth he was fighting for was bigger than his fear, bigger than the shadows gathering around him. In Roman's eyes, the risks were no longer obstacles. They were a testament to the power of his work. The more the authorities tried to silence him, the more he realized how deeply his efforts had shaken them. They were afraid of what he represented, a crack in their armor, a voice they couldn't fully control. The tension around Roman's life became suffocating. What had started as anonymous threats and subtle surveillance quickly escalated into a relentless campaign of intimidation. It was clear. The authorities wanted him to feel their presence in every aspect of his life. The once quiet streets around his home now buzzed with an unspoken menace. Strangers lingered too long on corners. Unmarked cars followed him in silence, and every day seemed to bring new eyes watching his every move. Roman began to feel the weight of their constant gaze. Simple errands turned into high-stakes missions. When he went to the market, he could see people in plain clothes observing him from across the aisles. They were always there, blending into the crowd, silent reminders that he was never truly alone. He'd grown accustomed to the prying eyes, the footsteps trailing him, but the isolation was taking its toll. Friends became distant, their once familiar faces shadowed by fear. Some had stopped answering his calls altogether, terrified of being drawn into his dangerous world. Each time he tried to communicate with his contacts for the anti-torture channel, he knew his words were being intercepted. Messages went missing, encrypted files disappeared, and even trusted methods of secure communication began to feel compromised. He started leaving his phone at home when he met with sources, speaking only in whispers, sometimes under the cover of night. But even then, he could sense the authorities closing in, their invisible presence pressing in from all sides, waiting for him to slip up. Then, the harassment turned physical. One night, as he walked down a quiet alleyway, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking his path. Another closed in from behind. Without a word, they shoved him against the wall, holding him there just long enough to whisper a warning. "Stop what you're doing, or next time it won't be this gentle." They left as quickly as they'd appeared, vanishing into the darkness, leaving Roman shaken but more determined than ever. This was no longer just surveillance. It was a direct attempt to break him, to instill fear that would make him question his every action. Roman tried to keep going, tried to hold on to the hope that his work mattered, that it would make a difference. But the pressure became unrelenting. His heart pounded each time he stepped outside, every noise and shadow a potential threat. His family, once a source of strength, now lived in constant fear. They urged him to leave, to find a way out, to abandon the fight that had brought such terror to their lives. But Roman knew that stepping back now would mean surrendering to the very forces he had fought so hard to expose. The first arrest came suddenly, without warning. Late one evening, as he prepared to meet a contact, a squad of officers arrived at his door. There was no pretense, no explanation. They forced their way in, ransacking his apartment, pulling apart his life in search of evidence. Roman watched as they went through his belongings, his computer, his notebooks, anything that might implicate him. He knew they didn't need proof. They only needed an excuse, a reason to detain him, to make an example of him. As they handcuffed him and led him away, Roman felt the weight of the moment, the cold realization that he was now in their hands. The journey to the station was silent, the officers' expressions grim, their eyes focused ahead as if they were carrying out a sentence already decided. Inside the cell, surrounded by walls that held countless others before him, Roman sat in the darkness, his thoughts racing. He had known this was a possibility, had prepared himself for it. But nothing could fully brace him for the reality of imprisonment, the suffocating sense of being stripped of his freedom. Yet, even in that cold, damp cell, Roman held on to his purpose. The fear, the isolation, the constant threats, they were proof of the impact he was making. Proof that the truths he was uncovering struck at the heart of those who wielded power unjustly. And as he waited, his thoughts turned not to escape, but to the work that lay ahead. He knew this was only the beginning, that his fight had now become a personal battle with the very system he sought to bring down. The day of Roman's arrest began like any other, though he couldn't shake a feeling of unease, a quiet intuition that something was about to shift. He had been cautious, meticulous even with his recent work. Every move was calculated, every meeting carefully arranged. But in the back of his mind, he knew he was living on borrowed time, and today that time ran out. It happened in the late afternoon. Roman was returning home when he noticed a line of unmarked cars idling near his building, their dark windows concealing the faces inside. A few men, dressed in plain clothes yet unmistakably official, lingered by the entrance. His pulse quickened as he approached, trying to appear calm, though every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn back. But it was too late. The moment he stepped onto the building's front step, they moved in. Roman Ivanov, one of them said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You're coming with us." Without another word, they seized him, gripping his arms firmly, denying him any chance to protest. The men barely spoke as they led him to one of the cars, shoving him into the back seat before he could ask what he was being accused of. Roman knew better than to demand answers. These were not men who responded to questions. He recognized the routine, a display of power, a warning not just to him, but to anyone who might dare follow in his footsteps. Inside the car, Roman's mind raced as he tried to imagine what charges they could conjure against him. He was no stranger to threats, to false accusations meant to intimidate him. But this was different. They had crossed a line, taking him without pretext, without explanation. As the car sped through the city, he forced himself to steady his breathing, preparing for whatever was to come. Upon arrival at the station, they read him the charges, and his heart sank. They were accusing him of spreading false information to incite public unrest and compromising state security, fabricated charges designed to silence him under the guise of maintaining order. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. Roman's work, built on truth and courage, was now twisted into a crime against the very system he sought to expose. He felt a wave of anger rise within him, but he knew that any resistance would only serve their narrative. He was booked, fingerprinted, and processed without so much as an acknowledgement of his innocence. The officers handled him with the cold efficiency of people well versed in breaking the spirits of those who defied them. They treated him as a threat, as if he were the criminal, all while he stood for justice against the very crimes they were complicit in hiding. As they led him down a dim hallway toward a holding cell, he felt the weight of his reality pressing down on him, the realization that he was now under their control, a pawn in their game. In the cold, cramped cell, Roman sat alone, the echo of his heartbeat filling the silence. He tried to steel himself, to remind himself of his mission, of the people who had entrusted him with their stories, their pain. But the shock of his detainment gnawed at him. He had expected threats, intimidation, even physical confrontations. But this, being held, accused of treasonous acts, felt surreal, a nightmare he could not wake from. As the hours stretched on, he realized that this arrest was more than a warning. It was a message, not just to him, but to anyone who might think of joining his cause. They had crafted this moment to send a clear signal. Dissent would not be tolerated, and anyone who dared to pull back the curtain on their misdeeds would pay the price. Roman's trial was less about justice and more about spectacle. A calculated display designed to affirm the power of the authorities and to publicly humiliate him for daring to speak out. From the moment he stepped into the courtroom, he sensed that the outcome had already been decided. The room was filled with officials and onlookers, each one an actor in a grim play orchestrated to strip him of his dignity and silence his voice. The prosecutor took center stage, presenting Roman not as a citizen with a mission for justice, but as a dangerous agitator intent on destabilizing society. The accusations were absurd. Claims that he had conspired with foreign entities to undermine the state, that he had orchestrated a campaign of lies to incite unrest. Every word twisted the truth beyond recognition, portraying him as a threat to public order, a puppet of hostile forces. Roman's heart pounded with indignation as he listened, each lie sharper than the last, cutting through his composure. When his turn came to speak, Roman tried to address the court calmly, to explain the true nature of his work. He spoke of the prisoners he defended, the injustices he had witnessed, the families torn apart by a system that preyed on the powerless. His voice was steady, yet he could feel the fury building within him. But as he spoke, he could see that his words were falling on deaf ears. The judge's gaze remained cold, impassive, his mind clearly set long before Roman had entered the room. Roman's lawyer, assigned by the court and clearly loyal to the system, did little to defend him. When it came time for cross-examination, his questions were half-hearted, his objections weak, as though he was simply fulfilling a formality. Every avenue of defense was shut down before he could even begin. Evidence was ignored, testimonies dismissed, and every attempt Roman made to tell his side of the story was met with silence or thinly veiled contempt. It became painfully clear that this was not a trial but a scripted performance, a spectacle meant to reinforce the power of those who control the narrative. As the trial dragged on, Roman felt a rising sense of helplessness. He had been prepared for hostility, for resistance, but this was something altogether different. Here he was, forced to watch as his life's work was dismantled in front of him, as his character was torn apart by lies he could not refute, not because he lacked the truth, but because the truth was not allowed a voice in this room. His frustration simmered beneath the surface, an ache he could barely contain, knowing that no matter what he said, the outcome would remain the same. At one point, the prosecutor presented supposed evidence against him, a series of manipulated messages, fabricated documents that depicted him as a dangerous radical. Roman's hands clenched at his sides as he listened to the prosecutor read out these false documents, each word an affront to everything he had fought for. He looked around the room, hoping to see some flicker of doubt, some sign that someone, anyone, saw through this charade. But the faces around him remained stone-like, their silence a reminder of the futility of his struggle. The final blow came when the judge delivered his sentence. Roman's fate was declared in a monotone voice, as though reading from a script, condemning him to years of confinement for his so-called crimes. The sentence was harsh, designed not only to break him, but to serve as a warning to others who might dare to challenge the status quo. Roman felt a chill settle over him, a profound sense of betrayal, not just by the system, but by the very concept of justice he had once believed in. As he was led out of the courtroom in shackles, he felt the weight of his helplessness, the crushing realization that, in this place, truth held no power. His anger simmered, a silent vow forming in his heart. They could take his freedom, they could silence him in the eyes of the law, but they could not destroy his resolve. Locked in a cold, barren cell, Roman found himself grappling with a storm of emotions he had never felt so acutely. The walls seemed to press in, amplifying the silence and intensifying the loneliness that weighed on him. He felt trapped not just physically, but emotionally, ensnared by a system that had rendered him powerless, stripping away his dignity, his freedom, his very right to speak the truth. For the first time since beginning his mission, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. Had he sacrificed everything for nothing? Was his work, his fight for justice, truly worth the isolation, the humiliation, the loss of everything he held dear? Memories flooded his mind, the faces of those he had helped, the people whose stories he had risked everything to tell. Their voices echoed in his thoughts, a reminder of the horrors he had uncovered and the lives he had touched. But they felt distant now, blurred by the thick walls that separated him from the outside world. Each memory cut him deeply, intensifying the ache in his heart, a reminder of all he had lost and all that had yet to be achieved. His family haunted his thoughts, their faces marked with worry and fear. The risks he'd imposed upon them were no longer hypothetical. They were real, and they were suffering because of him. Friends had disappeared, allies had gone silent, and he was left alone, a lone warrior locked in a system designed to break his spirit. Every doubt, every fear, every threat he had ever received seemed to converge on him in that moment, a tidal wave of despair that left him feeling adrift, grasping for any anchor of purpose. Yet, as hours dragged on and the quiet darkness enveloped him, a deeper resolve began to stir within. Roman remembered why he had started this fight, why he had chosen this path in the first place. This struggle wasn't about him. It never had been. It was about the countless individuals whose pain he had witnessed, the voices that had been silenced, the stories buried under fear and intimidation. He had promised to stand for them, to be their voice, even when it meant facing dangers he could scarcely imagine. How could he turn his back on them now? The injustice he had experienced firsthand only strengthened his resolve. This trial, this prison, it was a testament to the very corruption he had fought so hard to reveal. Every threat, every fabricated charge, every moment of his captivity confirmed that his mission mattered, that his work had struck a nerve in the hearts of those who wished to keep their crimes hidden. They wanted him to surrender, to bend, to give in to the crushing weight of their authority. But he couldn't. His spirit, though battered, remained unbroken. Roman sat alone in that cell, his body weary but his heart ablaze. He knew the odds were stacked against him, that his path was littered with obstacles designed to keep him from ever seeing freedom. But he also knew that his purpose was far greater than his fear, greater than the isolation that threatened to consume him. He made a silent vow to himself and to those he had fought for, no matter how long they held him, no matter how deep they tried to bury his voice, he would not stop. Roman's entry into the prison system was a descent into a world unlike any he had ever known. The cold, concrete walls loomed around him, closing in like a fortress built to crush spirits and strip men of their humanity. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken rules, a silent code enforced not by law, but by an ecosystem designed to instill fear and submission. This was a place where weakness was preyed upon, where strength was measured by one's ability to endure the unendurable. Every morning, he woke to the blare of harsh lights and the echo of iron doors clanging open, a sound that seemed to rattle his very bones. The guards, faces hardened by years of enforcing brutal discipline, wasted no time in reminding him that here he had no power. Commands were barked with cold authority, the smallest sign of defiance met with swift punishment. Roman quickly learned to keep his head down, to observe without drawing attention, blending into the monotonous shuffle of prisoners moving in unison, like shadows devoid of identity. Food was scarce and barely edible, a lukewarm gruel that did little more than sustain his body, robbing him of the strength he once took for granted. The hunger gnawed at him constantly, a relentless reminder of his confinement. Nights were no better. Thin blankets did little to ward off the chill that seeped into his bones, and sleep was a rare luxury, interrupted by the screams of men lost to despair or the sudden jolt of a guard's baton rapping against the bars. Each night, he lay on his bunk, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling, his thoughts racing as he grappled with the endless monotony, the crushing silence punctuated only by the sounds of suffering. But it wasn't just the physical toll that wore him down. The mental strain was an unyielding torment, an endless battle to maintain his identity in a place where individuality was stripped away piece by piece. In here, time had no meaning. Days bled into nights, weeks into months, each one a slow erosion of self. Roman struggled to hold on to fragments of who he was, to remember his purpose, to cling to the beliefs that had once driven him. Yet, with every passing day, he felt pieces of himself slipping away, swallowed by the merciless routine of confinement. The other inmates were a mix of hardened criminals and souls crushed by circumstances beyond their control. Some eyed him with suspicion, others with silent respect, sensing that he was different, that he didn't belong in their world of violence and survival. But Roman had no allies here. To them, he was just another prisoner, another man caught in the gears of an unforgiving machine. The camaraderie that might have offered some relief was nowhere to be found. Instead, he was left to navigate a treacherous social landscape alone, constantly on guard, constantly bracing himself for whatever threat might come next. Even the simplest tasks became acts of endurance. Washing in freezing water, exercising in the small, bleak courtyard under the wary eyes of guards, enduring hours of forced labor, all served as reminders that he was no longer a free man, that his life was now dictated by others. His body weakened under the strain, muscles once strong now strained with exhaustion. The mental toll was equally severe, every small deprivation chipping away at his resolve, his mind drifting in and out of memories of a life that felt increasingly distant, almost like a dream he couldn't fully recall. Yet, even in this relentless cycle of hardship, Roman fought to retain a glimmer of his purpose. He knew that the system wanted to break him, that every day was an exercise in eroding his spirit. They wanted him to give in, to lose hope, to forget why he had ended up here in the first place. But despite the darkness, despite the overwhelming solitude, he clung to the belief that his fight was not over, that his cause still had meaning, even here, in this place designed to obliterate hope. Prison life was brutal, unyielding, and dehumanizing, but Roman resolved to survive it. He would endure the hunger, the cold, the endless hours of confinement. because he knew that giving up would mean surrendering to the very forces he had spent his life resisting. And so, each day he woke up, faced the grim reality before him, and found the strength to keep going. One breath, one step, one heartbeat at a time. As the weeks wore on, Roman's resilience became a quiet but powerful force within the prison walls. Though he was cautious, careful not to draw unnecessary attention, his demeanor did not go unnoticed. The other inmates saw in him something different, a calm strength, an unwavering resolve that set him apart from the broken men who shuffled through the corridors each day. His presence alone was a reminder that even in a place built to crush the human spirit, resistance was possible. Slowly, prisoners began to gravitate toward him. At first, it was simple nods in the courtyard, brief acknowledgements in the mess hall. But soon, they started sharing their stories with him, stories they had kept buried, tales of wrongful convictions, of betrayals and broken lives, of families left behind. Roman listened, offering understanding, a sympathetic ear in a place devoid of compassion. He knew that these men, for all their flaws, were fellow victims of a system that thrived on oppression and fear. Roman's patience and his willingness to listen became a balm to those around him, and a bond began to form, fragile at first but growing stronger with each shared story. They began to look to him as something more than just another inmate. To them, he was a symbol, a man who had fought the system openly, who had dared to challenge the forces they had learned to fear. He represented hope, a rare, dangerous thing within those walls. Word of Roman's background and his fight against the injustices in Russia spread among the prisoners, whispered from cell to cell, gathering momentum like a silent movement. Some prisoners came to him seeking advice, others for encouragement. He shared what little he could, talking to them about resilience, about survival, about holding on to the fragments of themselves that the system couldn't touch. For the first time, he felt a sense of community, a fellowship that ran deeper than the bleakness of their surroundings. They were bound not by circumstance, but by a mutual understanding of survival and a desire, however faint, to reclaim their dignity. Even in a place where trust was scarce and betrayal common, Roman managed to build something rare, a support network, a quiet brotherhood that lifted its members through the darkest moments. Together, they devised ways to resist, small acts of defiance that might seem insignificant to an outsider but meant everything within those walls. They shared food when rations ran low, passed along books and letters when possible, found small ways to keep each other informed and connected. They even managed to smuggle messages to the outside world, subtle signs that they had not been forgotten, that their voices still mattered. Roman became a beacon for men who had lost hope long ago. His presence reminded them that their lives held value even here, that they were more than the labels the authorities had imposed upon them. In a place where kindness was rare, he offered compassion. In a place where anger simmered constantly, he encouraged patience, bit by bit. The men around him began to feel the stirrings of purpose, a reason to endure, to hold on to themselves despite the grim reality of their imprisonment. Yet, Roman knew the risks of this newfound influence. The guards were watching, always alert to any hint of unity among the inmates. They understood that solidarity was dangerous, that the slightest spark of hope could ignite something beyond their control. But even as they increased their vigilance, their threats, Roman's resolve only strengthened. He knew that this fragile network he had helped create was not just about survival. It was about resistance. Every bond formed, every ally gained, was a quiet rebellion, a statement that even within the prison's oppressive walls, they would not be reduced to mere numbers. In a place where despair ruled, Roman had kindled something powerful, something dangerous. He had become more than just a prisoner. He was a symbol of resilience, of defiance, of the belief that even in the darkest of places, hope could survive. And with each day that passed, he carried the weight of that hope, not as a burden, but as a purpose that no prison walls could take from him. In a place where control was absolute, where every aspect of life was dictated by the cold authority of the guards, Roman found ways to resist, subtle acts that preserved his dignity and reminded the others that they were still human, still capable of standing tall. These were small rebellions, the kind that went unnoticed by some but carried profound meaning to those who witnessed them. For Roman, each act was a message to himself and others. They might be imprisoned, but they would not be defeated. One of Roman's earliest acts of defiance was refusing to lower his gaze whenever a guard barked orders or tried to intimidate him. He understood that his body language was a powerful statement. In a place where fear ruled, even the act of meeting someone's eyes was a quiet rebellion. The guards noticed, of course. They sneered, warned him to know his place, but Roman continued to look them straight in the eyes, refusing to submit, to shrink. This simple act began to inspire the men around him, and soon other prisoners followed his lead, reclaiming a piece of their dignity by standing firm in their stance, meeting the guards' glares with unyielding resolve. Another act of resistance came in the form of his words. Roman was known for his ability to speak with calm, unwavering conviction. He would talk to the other inmates about hope, about justice, about the importance of retaining their sense of self despite the attempts to break them. At night, when the prison was cloaked in darkness and silence, he shared stories of resilience, speaking in hushed tones that carried through the cells. These were stories of people who had faced impossible odds and had emerged with their spirits intact, and each tale became a lifeline, a reminder that even here they could endure. Roman found ways to subvert the rules, small rebellions that went undetected but carried immense weight for those who took part. He helped organize a system of communication among the prisoners, a method of passing notes and messages that the guards had yet to discover. Through this network, inmates shared fragments of poetry, lines from books, personal reflections, each one a spark of humanity in a place designed to extinguish it. Roman knew the risks, but he also knew the importance of these messages, how they reminded the prisoners that they were still thinkers, still individuals with thoughts and dreams that the prison could not erase. In the bleak hours of labor, Roman would offer his fellow inmates quiet words of encouragement, a pat on the shoulder, a shared moment of strength that often went unnoticed by the guards. When one man faltered, weakened by exhaustion, Roman would step in, quietly helping to carry the load, offering his support in ways that defied the guards' attempts to pit them against one another. He understood that in their unity, they found strength, that by refusing to turn on each other, they resisted the isolation the system tried to impose. One day, in an act that would become legend among the prisoners, Roman staged a silent protest during roll call. When his name was called, he refused to answer, standing in silence as the guards demanded a response. His defiance was quiet, unspoken, yet it carried a fierce message. Even as the guards dragged him away, punished him with hours in solitary confinement, Roman's fellow inmates watched with admiration. His silence had spoken louder than words, an act that reminded them all that they could choose not to submit, not to surrender their will. In solitary confinement, Roman clung to that sense of defiance, enduring the darkness, the silence, the isolation with a steadfast spirit. Alone, he repeated phrases to himself, lines of poetry, passages from books he had memorized, anything that would help him keep his mind sharp, his resolve unbroken. When he was finally returned to his cell, bruised but unbowed, his fellow prisoners saw the spark in his eyes and felt the power of his unyielding spirit. To them, Roman had become more than a man. He was a symbol of resistance, a figure whose defiance gave them strength to endure their own trials. Every act, every whispered word, every silent refusal was a rebellion against a system that sought to strip them of their humanity. Through these moments of defiance, Roman showed the others that they could retain their dignity, that they could stand together even in the darkest of places. And as word of his small but powerful rebellion spread, he became a beacon of hope, a reminder that while they might be imprisoned, their spirits remained free. With every passing week, Roman felt the weight of the state's scrutiny bearing down on him. It was no longer just an occasional reminder of his monitored status. It had escalated into a relentless presence that shadowed his every move. Surveillance was woven into the fabric of his life, inescapable and constant. Phones he used clicked and buzzed with strange echoes, messages were delayed or suspiciously rerouted, and contacts he reached out to often responded with warnings that his communications had been compromised. Agents from the state no longer tried to conceal their watch. Unmarked cars parked near his home, their occupants openly observing him, as if to ensure he understood that he was never truly alone. At times, he would turn a corner and catch sight of familiar faces, the same agents stationed at his workplace, near his favorite cafe, outside the few trusted contacts he still dared to visit. They moved with chilling efficiency, making sure that their presence was felt without a word. The threats, too, became more overt. Anonymous messages found their way into his inbox, each one darker than the last. They were laced with warnings and chilling details of his activities and interactions, proof that he was under close watch. Some messages hinted at consequences that extended beyond him, thinly veiled threats aimed at his family and any friends who remained by his side. The language was unmistakable, a reminder that any continued resistance would come at a heavy cost. Whenever Roman tried to attend meetings or gather support, his attempts were disrupted. His planned gatherings were mysteriously cancelled before they could even begin, venues refusing to host him last minute, colleagues suddenly unable to meet. Online, accounts he set up for outreach and advocacy were blocked, flagged, or hacked, shutting down his platforms as soon as they gained traction. It was a methodical assault on his ability to organize, a calculated strategy to dismantle any momentum he might build. And yet, through the mounting pressure, Roman refused to be completely silenced. He worked in whispers, in codes reaching out cautiously to those he trusted, operating on the margins of what was still possible. Each day was a test of endurance and ingenuity, a game of survival under the eye of a powerful adversary. Roman knew that they wanted him to abandon his work, to retreat into silence. But with each new threat, he found a renewed commitment to continue, holding on to his purpose even as the walls around him closed in. Despite the intense surveillance and mounting threats, Roman knew that he could not fight this battle alone. He needed allies, people who understood his mission, shared his passion for justice, and were willing to risk standing against the state's oppressive machinery. Carefully, he began to reach out, following whispers within the activist circles and connecting with others who had endured similar struggles. His cautious approach helped him forge bonds with those who had also experienced the brutal tactics of suppression and intimidation, people who had learned how to navigate the shadows without being overtaken by them. One of his first allies was Sophia, a journalist with a reputation for fearless reporting on government corruption. She, too, had paid a heavy price for her dedication, losing her position at a major news outlet and finding her work increasingly censored. Yet her resolve remained unbroken. Roman's story resonated with her deeply, and the two quickly bonded over their shared experiences of imprisonment and surveillance. Sophia's knowledge of covert communication methods, as well as her extensive network of contacts within the media, became invaluable. Together, they developed strategies to leak information without compromising themselves, finding creative ways to slip messages past the state's watchful eye. Through Sophia, Roman connected with a small but resilient network of activists spread across the country. Among them was Alexei, a former lawyer turned human rights advocate, whose understanding of the legal system helped them navigate the complexities of state repression. With Alexei's guidance, they could identify legal loopholes, push boundaries, and document abuses more effectively. His knowledge helped them craft responses to protect themselves, ensuring that their actions fell just within the lines of legality, frustrating the authorities who sought to silence them. Roman's network continued to grow as he connected with a group of students who had become disillusioned with the system, hungry for change and inspired by the stories emerging from the anti-torture channel. These young activists, undeterred by fear, brought an energy and creativity that injected new life into Roman's work. They helped amplify his message online, using encrypted channels and decentralized platforms to reach wider audiences. The students taught him about newer technologies that the state hadn't yet fully monitored, allowing them to communicate securely and spread critical information without detection. Through these alliances, Roman began to feel the power of collective resistance. What had once been a solitary mission now became a coordinated effort, a growing force that shared a common vision. Together, they devised new ways to gather stories, interview victims of abuse, and create detailed reports that could be sent to international organizations. Roman's allies believed in his mission, seeing him not just as a survivor, but as a leader, someone who could rally others to stand against injustice. The unity they forged was their shield, a bond that gave them strength against the oppressive forces they faced daily. This growing network of voices, skills, and courage transformed Roman's mission, giving him the support and solidarity he had so desperately needed. Though they remained cautious, operating in the shadows, each alliance brought them closer to the day when they could stand together openly, united in their demand for justice. Roman knew that this network of allies would be his strongest weapon. With their help, he could continue his work with a resilience that was no longer just his own. It was the combined strength of many who, like him, had chosen to defy the silence. The mission was no longer his alone. It was a shared journey, one that carried the hope of a better future, built through the courage of those who refused to surrender. Roman's second arrest came swiftly and without warning, a brutal reminder of the state's unforgiving reach. He had been meeting discreetly with a group of allies when officers stormed in, dragging him away with barely a word, his pleas for an explanation ignored. This time, there was no attempt to mask the intent. The state wanted to make an example of him. They wanted to show him, and anyone who might follow him, that dissent would be met with harsh and unyielding punishment. The conditions of his second imprisonment were far worse than before. The cell they placed him in was smaller, the walls damp with mold, the air thick and stale, as if even the idea of fresh air had been banished. The single light overhead flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows that added to the oppressive atmosphere. Roman's bed was nothing more than a thin, filthy mattress laid on the cold floor, its springs broken and protruding, leaving him sore and sleepless after every long night. Unlike his first imprisonment, this time the guards made it clear that he was not merely a prisoner. He was an enemy. Every interaction was laced with hostility, each guard's gaze heavy with disdain and contempt. They didn't speak to him unless it was to order him around or insult him, their tone sharp, calculated to erode his spirit. They forced him into grueling, menial labor, tasks designed to exhaust him physically and humiliate him emotionally. He spent hours scrubbing floors, his hands raw and aching, or lifting weights of meaningless junk, knowing it served no purpose other than to break him down. Food was barely enough to keep him alive. A thin soup and scraps of stale bread that left him perpetually hungry, his body weakened from malnutrition. Water was rationed cruelly, often withheld altogether as a form of punishment. Days passed in a fog of exhaustion. His body ached constantly, every bone and muscle protesting the endless cycle of deprivation and forced labor. The lack of proper nutrition and rest began to wear on him, his frame thinning as his strength slowly ebbed. But perhaps the worst of it was the psychological torment. The guards took every opportunity to remind him that he was forgotten, isolated, and abandoned by the world. They told him that his allies had moved on, that his work had been silenced, that he was no longer relevant or remembered. They whispered lies designed to sow doubt, to chip away at the purpose that had once driven him so fiercely. His mind, already strained, was haunted by the possibility that they might be right, that his struggle had been for nothing. Isolation became a weapon wielded with precision. Roman was rarely allowed to interact with other prisoners, kept separate, as if he were a contagion, something dangerous that could infect others with ideas of resistance. Days passed without human contact, the silence amplifying his own fears and anxieties. In moments of weakness, he found himself talking to the walls, his own voice the only sound in a sea of quiet that bordered on madness. The loneliness was a shadow that lingered in every corner, filling the cell with a weight heavier than any physical restraint. Occasionally, they would throw him into solitary confinement for days on end, the darkness absolute, the silence suffocating. In that space, time lost meaning, and his mind struggled to hold on to reality. Without light or sound, he felt himself drifting, his thoughts scattering like dust, his memories slipping through his fingers. He clung desperately to fragments of hope, scraps of purpose, repeating mantras to himself, reciting passages he had memorized, anything to keep his mind tethered to something beyond the emptiness of his cell. The guards' tactics grew more insidious, calculated to strip him of his dignity and humanity. Sometimes they would drag him from his cell in the middle of the night, subjecting him to hours of interrogation, hurling baseless accusations and twisting his words. They tried to force confessions, to make him admit to crimes he hadn't committed, hoping to break his spirit under the weight of their lies. When he refused, they punished him with further isolation, extended labor, and the cruel denial of even basic comforts. But through it all, Roman held on to a stubborn, unbreakable piece of himself. Even in his darkest hours, when exhaustion threatened to overtake him, he would remember why he had begun this fight. He would picture the faces of the people he had helped, recall the voices of his allies, and remind himself that he was part of something greater than this prison cell. Though his body was weakened, his spirit remained defiant, a quiet fire that refused to be extinguished. This second imprisonment was a nightmare, a world of suffering that seemed endless. But Roman knew that as long as he held onto that fire within, the state could never truly claim victory. And so, amidst the despair and deprivation, he resolved to survive, to endure whatever they threw at him, knowing that his resistance, however small, was a beacon of defiance that no prison could contain. In the harsh confines of prison, Roman discovered that survival was as much a matter of mental resilience as it was physical endurance. Faced with unrelenting hardship, he quickly realized that his spirit would be his strongest ally, and he clung to it with a fierce determination. Where the state sought to crush his will, he fought to keep his mind sharp, his thoughts clear, and his heart steadfast. In his isolation, he devised strategies to sustain himself, building mental fortresses that could withstand even the darkest days. Roman created routines, a rhythm to anchor himself amidst the endless chaotic days. Every morning, he would engage in physical exercises, pushing his weakened body through a set of movements he remembered from his life before prison. This simple act grounded him, reminding him of his autonomy over his own body, however limited. As his muscles strained and his breath quickened, he felt a flicker of strength, a reminder that while they could control his surroundings, they could not dictate his resolve. When he was granted time in the communal spaces, Roman became a silent yet steady presence among the other inmates. He had earned a reputation by then, not only as a man who had resisted the system outside these walls, but as one who continued to resist from within. Fellow prisoners would seek him out, exchanging glances or brief words, and slowly, a quiet network of solidarity began to form around him. Roman recognized the power of this connection, this unspoken bond forged in shared suffering, and he took it upon himself to offer what little guidance and support he could. He became a source of calm for others, a voice that encouraged patience and dignity even in the face of the guards' cruelty. Roman would share simple coping techniques with those who struggled, offering words of encouragement and advice on how to endure the psychological strain. He taught them to focus on small victories, the ability to maintain composure during an interrogation, the courage to endure a punishment without breaking. These were the battles they could win, however small, victories that kept their spirits alive. One of his most important strategies was the art of holding on to hope in silence. Roman knew that overt resistance could lead to further punishment, but he encouraged others to resist in subtle ways. He taught them the power of inner strength, of preserving their thoughts and memories as private sanctuaries that no guard could reach. They can cage your body, but your mind is yours, he would whisper in quiet moments. Protect it. Keep it safe. These words spread like an underground current, offering strength to those who might otherwise have succumbed to despair. Roman also used his limited interactions to instill a sense of purpose among the inmates. He encouraged them to think beyond the prison walls, to remember that life existed outside, and that their suffering held meaning beyond the confines of their cells. He reminded them that they were witnesses to the abuses of power, and that their stories could one day be told. In those conversations, he planted seeds of resilience, knowing that even the faintest glimmer of hope could help them withstand the crushing weight of confinement. As the months wore on, Roman's presence became a stabilizing force, a leader without title or authority. Other inmates would look to him during tense situations, and he found himself quietly guiding them, his own inner strength serving as an anchor. When conflicts arose among the prisoners, a natural result of frustration and the intense pressure of confinement, Roman would step in, mediating with a calm authority that helped diffuse the tension. In a place where anger simmered dangerously, he became a beacon of calm, a reminder that they were more than their circumstances. Through all of this, Roman managed to foster a spirit of quiet defiance. He encouraged others to preserve small rituals that connected them to their past lives, a favorite phrase, a family memory, a belief in something greater. He spoke of endurance, of outlasting their captors through patience and resilience. Roman showed them that survival was an act of rebellion, that every day they endured was a refusal to yield to the state's cruelty. For Roman, these strategies of survival were not just about self-preservation, they were acts of solidarity. By supporting others, he fortified himself, drawing strength from the shared resilience of those around him. In helping others stay strong, he felt his own spirit fortified, his purpose renewed. Even within the prison's bleak walls, he found a way to continue his fight, each act of survival a testament to his unbreakable will. As the months turned into years, the relentless strain of prison life began to take a visible toll on Roman's health. His body, once resilient and strong, had been worn down by malnutrition, sleepless nights, and the constant weight of psychological stress. He moved more slowly now, his frame gaunt and weakened, each step a reminder of the daily suffering that had carved itself into his bones. His joints ached, his muscles felt hollow, and every small exertion became an ordeal, his body protesting the toll of relentless deprivation. The worst of it, however, was the persistent illness that settled into his lungs, a rasping cough that refused to leave, a harsh reminder of the cold, damp conditions he endured. The prison's inadequate medical care did little to alleviate his suffering. He was given aspirin for pain, water for his cough, and empty promises of proper treatment that never materialized. Nights became battles for breath, his chest tightening as he lay awake, eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, fighting to find the air that seemed increasingly elusive. Despite his deteriorating condition, Roman's spirit clung to its purpose, even as his body faltered. Yet, in moments of brutal honesty, he recognized a grim truth. If he remained here, he would not survive much longer. The guards saw his struggle, their eyes cold as they watched him weaken, indifferent to his suffering. The system that had imprisoned him cared nothing for his life or his health. Roman was just another problem they hoped would fade away, a nuisance they wished would disappear quietly. It was in the depths of this crisis that Roman began to think about escape, not just as a vague hope, but as a real, necessary plan for survival. The thought had lingered at the edges of his mind for some time, but now it crystallized, fueled by the urgency of his failing health. He understood that if he were to continue his fight, if he were to survive long enough to see the mission through, he would have to find a way out, to break free from the prison walls that were slowly closing in on him. Yet, escape was no simple feat. He knew the risks were monumental. Guards were everywhere, surveillance constant, and even the faintest misstep would lead to dire consequences. But his condition had left him with little choice. Staying meant a slow, inevitable decline, an end orchestrated by the prison's merciless conditions. Leaving was his only chance to reclaim his life, to continue his work, to remind the world of the voices silenced within those walls. Roman's mind began to work through the details, gathering fragments of information he had collected over time. He remembered subtle details about the guards' routines, the blind spots in surveillance, the schedules that allowed brief moments of vulnerability. He started to map out a plan, holding onto each piece of knowledge like a precious key that could unlock his path to freedom. Escape became more than an idea. It became his lifeline, the single thought that propelled him forward each day, his body barely holding on as his spirit willed it to survive just a little longer. He spoke to a few trusted allies, sharing only the barest hints of his intentions. He couldn't risk exposure, couldn't trust that every ear around him was loyal. But those who knew saw the resolve in his eyes, the quiet, steely determination that had carried him this far. In hushed tones, they offered support, subtle gestures of solidarity that reminded him he was not entirely alone in this endeavor. They believed in him, knew that if anyone could make it out, it was Roman. As his health continued to decline, the urgency to act grew stronger. He had no illusions about the dangers that lay ahead. The journey would be perilous, and success was far from guaranteed. But the possibility of freedom, of regaining his voice and resuming the fight, was worth any risk. Roman knew that this might be his final stand, a chance to defy the system one last time, to slip through their grasp and carry his mission beyond the walls of confinement. With each passing day, his body weakened, but his resolve grew sharper, clearer. He was ready to take the risk, to do whatever it took to reclaim his life. Roman would fight his way out, not just for himself, but for every soul he had vowed to stand for. This escape would be his act of defiance that his mission, his purpose, was far greater than the walls that sought to contain it. That his mission, his purpose, was far greater than the walls that sought to contain it. The decision to flee weighed heavily on Roman's heart. For years, he had fought with a fierce loyalty to his homeland, believing that his mission could only be fulfilled within its borders. Russia was his home, the land that had shaped him, where his family's roots ran deep. Every corner, every familiar face, was part of the life he had always known. And despite the suffering he had endured, his bond with his country remained strong, an unbreakable thread connecting him to its people, to the countless souls whose stories of injustice had become his purpose. But now he faced a choice that tore at his soul. Staying meant almost certain death, a slow, inevitable descent within the prison walls, a fate that would silence his voice forever. Yet the thought of leaving felt like a betrayal. To abandon his homeland felt as though he were surrendering, conceding defeat to the very forces he had stood against for so long. The idea of walking away from the fight left a hollow ache in his chest, a feeling that he was leaving behind a piece of himself, of the mission that had given his life meaning. In the quiet moments of solitude, Roman wrestled with this inner conflict. He knew that his work wasn't done, that leaving could offer him the chance to continue his fight from afar. He could become a voice for those still trapped within, amplifying the stories of those who could not speak for themselves. But the idea of freedom felt bittersweet, tainted by the knowledge that he would be severing his connection to his homeland, a place he had once vowed never to abandon. In the end, it was his mission that guided his decision. Roman realized that his loyalty was not bound to geography. It was tied to the people he had sworn to defend, to the cause that demanded his survival. By leaving, he wasn't giving up. He was ensuring that his work could continue, that the voices he carried would not be silenced. This was not a retreat, but a strategic choice, a way to preserve the truth he had fought so hard to reveal. With a heavy heart, Roman prepared himself for the journey ahead, knowing that each step toward freedom would also be a step away from the place he loved. As he made his final preparations, he felt the weight of loss mingling with a spark of hope. This escape was bittersweet, a departure from everything familiar, yet a path that held the promise of survival, of strength renewed. Roman would carry his homeland with him, even as he fled its borders, his heart tethered to the land he could no longer stay to defend. Roman's escape was fraught with peril from the very beginning. Every step he took was shadowed by the constant threat of discovery, the sense that at any moment, the authorities could catch up, unraveling his carefully laid plans in an instant. He had no guarantee of safe passage, only the fragile hope that his knowledge of the system's blind spots would be enough to carry him across the borders and into freedom. His journey began under the cover of darkness, slipping out of a place where cameras and guards were always alert, always watching. The first hurdle came quickly, a checkpoint he had known would be heavily monitored. He had memorized the guard's rotation schedule, hoping to time his movements to the narrow window when attention would be lax. But as he approached, a beam of light swept unexpectedly close, catching a glimpse of his shadow in the dimness. Roman froze, heart pounding as the guard's flashlight traced a path dangerously near his hiding place. He held his breath, every muscle tense, until the light moved away and the guard turned, oblivious to the figure crouched mere steps from detection. Pushing onward, he navigated a series of narrow alleyways, each one feeling more exposed than the last. Every noise, a scurrying rat, a distant shout, sent his pulse racing. He knew that any encounter could be catastrophic. Any bystander, any unfamiliar face could be an informant, ready to alert the authorities of his escape. His instincts sharpened with each step, his senses tuned to every detail, every shadow that could conceal either safety or danger. Halfway through the journey, Roman's path took him through a densely wooded area, a place where he hoped he could move undetected. But as he trekked through the underbrush, the distant rumble of engines shattered the quiet night. Panic tightened his chest as he realized that a patrol was making its way toward him. With nowhere else to go, he flattened himself against the cold ground, pulling branches and leaves over his body in a desperate attempt to blend into the landscape. The headlights cut through the trees, sweeping over him as he lay completely still, his face pressed into the earth, every nerve on fire. The patrol passed slowly, the sound of the engines fading as they moved away, leaving Roman shaking but unharmed. As dawn approached, Roman's path led him to a secluded riverbank, the final barrier before reaching the border. He had arranged for a contact to leave a small boat hidden under a tangle of branches, and to his relief, it was there, concealed just as planned. He pushed the boat into the water, his hands trembling from exhaustion and the weight of every close call along the way. The river was calm, the early light casting ripples across its surface, yet Roman felt no sense of peace. The border was near, but he knew that guards patrolled the riverbanks, watching for any sign of movement. Rowing silently, he kept close to the bank, every stroke measured and slow to avoid detection. Halfway across, a distant shout rang out from the shore, his heart seizing as he imagined that he'd been spotted. He braced himself, scanning the bank for movement, straining to make out any sign of pursuit. But the shouts faded, replaced by the quiet lapping of water against his boat. He exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm, knowing that any moment of panic could mean the difference between escape and capture. Finally, as he reached the other side of the river, Roman felt a surge of relief tempered by lingering fear. He knew he couldn't relax, not yet. He moved quickly, abandoning the boat and disappearing into the forest beyond the riverbank, putting as much distance between himself and the border as he could manage. The journey had taken everything he had, his strength, his endurance, his will. But as he looked ahead into the unknown, he felt the faintest spark of hope. Roman was free, but he knew that freedom came at a cost. He had left everything behind, his homeland, his friends, his family. Yet, as he walked deeper into the forest, he realized he had carried with him the one thing that mattered most, his mission. And with that, he stepped forward into a new life, a new chapter, carrying the stories and struggles of those left behind, determined to continue the fight from beyond the reach of those who had tried so hard to silence him. After what felt like a lifetime of evading shadows and dodging the ever-present threat of capture, Roman finally set foot on French soil. The journey had been long, grueling, and laden with close calls that haunted his every step. But here, as he breathed in the fresh, unfamiliar air of freedom, a sense of relief washed over him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. The weight of his homeland, the burdens he had carried, felt distant yet profoundly close, a reminder of both his loss and his purpose. France was a world apart, alive with a freedom he had only glimpsed from afar. For the first time in what felt like ages, he walked openly, unburdened by the constant fear of being watched, followed, or betrayed. Yet, even amidst the safety of his newfound refuge, he could feel the echoes of his mission pulling at him, reminding him that his work was far from over. His journey might have ended here, but his purpose had only deepened, his resolve strengthened by the hardships he had endured. Roman's arrival sparked a new beginning, one filled with possibilities he could scarcely have imagined during his darkest days in confinement. He wasted no time connecting with human rights organizations, sharing his story, finding allies who understood the magnitude of his mission. In France, he discovered a network of activists, journalists, and advocates who were eager to support him, to give voice to the stories he had carried with him from Russia. Here, he found a platform that allowed him to speak freely, to share the truths he had once been forced to whisper in shadows. But freedom, Roman realized, was not an end, it was a responsibility. The safety he had found was a privilege, one that came with the duty to continue his fight for those who remained behind. He knew that his journey had not only given him the strength to survive, but the opportunity to shine a light on the darkness he had escaped. From this new vantage point, he could be louder, bolder, a voice that could echo beyond borders and reach the people who needed it most. In the quiet moments, as he adjusted to his new life, Roman felt both joy and sorrow. He was free, yet his heart remained with those still trapped in the system he had left behind. France was a sanctuary, a chance to rebuild, but it was also a reminder that his fight was not his alone. He carried within him the stories of countless others, and with each day that passed, he felt his dedication grow, renewed by the memory of what he had endured. This was not an end to his journey, but the beginning of a new chapter. In France, Roman had found a place where he could continue his mission without fear. And with that freedom, he vowed to remain steadfast, to keep pushing forward, to fight for justice with every ounce of strength he had left. His escape had given him the gift of a voice, and he would use it not just for himself, but for all those whose stories he had promised to tell. In the quiet of his new life in France, Roman often found himself looking back on the path that had brought him here, each memory sharp with purpose and pain. He reflected on the injustices he had witnessed, the horrors that had once felt inescapable, buried within Russia's hidden corridors. The faces of those who had trusted him with their stories haunted him, their voices echoing in his mind, a reminder of why he had chosen this path, a path he could have easily avoided had he turned away, stayed silent, or compromised. But Roman knew that silence had never been an option for him. Every act of cruelty he uncovered, every story of suffering, had fueled his mission, shaping him into the man he had become. Sitting safely in France, free from the shadows that had once loomed so close, he thought about the men and women he had left behind. He remembered the prisoners who had risked everything to share their stories, whispering secrets through bars, entrusting him with truths that could have cost them their lives. He remembered the families torn apart by corruption, mothers and fathers who waited in fear and hopelessness, wondering if they would ever see their loved ones again. Their stories, their resilience, had become a part of him, a part he could never forget, even now. Roman's journey had been one of constant battles. First within the walls of his homeland, and then within the depths of the prison, where he had nearly lost everything. He had endured their attempts to silence him, their strategies to break him, and yet he had emerged with his purpose intact. And here, in his new life abroad, that purpose felt more urgent than ever. The distance had not lessened his commitment. Instead, it had sharpened it, allowing him to see the bigger picture, to realize just how vital his work had become. Living in freedom was bittersweet, for with it came the understanding that so many others remained trapped, voiceless, unable to tell the world of their suffering. Roman knew that he was not only free to continue his mission, but that he had a responsibility to use this freedom as a platform. From here, he could amplify their voices in ways that were impossible before. He could speak openly, publish their stories, and push for action without fearing the midnight knock or the ominous shadows that once followed him. Roman's current mission, though far from his homeland, was no less powerful. In fact, his journey had only strengthened his resolve to expose the injustices he had fought against. Now, he could reach a global audience, rally international support, and bring attention to the corruption and cruelty that plagued his country's prison system. Every article, every interview, every speech he gave was a step in the fight, a beacon for those he had left behind, a promise that he would not abandon them. Reflecting on all he had endured, Roman understood that his journey was more than a personal battle. It was a mission of shared resilience, of carrying forth the stories that others could not. His life in France was just another chapter, a new stage in a long and unfinished fight. The hardships he had faced had given him strength, but they had also given him a duty, to ensure that the world would know what he had seen, to keep the flame of resistance alive. And with that understanding, he committed himself fully to his cause, a fighter who, despite the miles between him and his homeland, would never stop fighting for justice. In the years that followed his escape, Roman's story grew beyond borders, resonating with people around the world. He had become more than just a voice against the brutal prison system of his homeland. He was a symbol of unwavering courage, a beacon for all who sought justice in places that seemed void of hope. His journey, from enduring the suffocating confines of prison to standing free in a foreign land, still fighting for those he had left behind, inspired others to believe in the possibility of change, even in the darkest of circumstances. Roman's image became a rallying point for activists, dissidents, and ordinary citizens who longed for justice in their own lives and communities. People saw in him the courage to resist, to rise above oppression, to speak truth to power, even when the odds were insurmountable. His story of survival and relentless pursuit of justice offered them a vision of what was possible, a reminder that the struggle for dignity and human rights was universal, transcending boundaries and nationalities. Through interviews, articles, and speeches, Roman became a powerful advocate, not just for those trapped in Russia's prison system, but for all who faced repression worldwide. He spoke not only of his own hardships, but of the collective struggle, the shared yearning for freedom that unites people across all lands. His words resonated deeply, a testament to the strength of the human spirit, an affirmation that resilience could indeed lead to change. Roman's resilience echoed through activist circles, inspiring networks of advocates and communities around the globe. His story reminded them that justice could be pursued from anywhere, that freedom, once grasped, could fuel a movement greater than any one individual. To the world, Roman was no longer just a former prisoner. He was a symbol of hope, a living testament to the power of defiance and the enduring strength of those who refused to be silenced. In him, people found inspiration to keep fighting their own battles, to stand up against injustice, no matter how daunting. Roman had become a symbol for a global audience, a reminder that as long as there were people willing to resist, justice would remain within reach, no matter how distant. And so, he stood not just as a man, but as a movement, a force of courage for all who dared to believe in a better world. Roman's story stands as a powerful reminder that the fight for freedom, justice, and human dignity is never over. And it is one that belongs to all of us. His journey, marked by unimaginable hardship, relentless courage, and the unwavering pursuit of truth, calls us to recognize the power each of us holds to make a difference, no matter where we are. Today, countless people around the world face oppression, their voices silenced, their rights stripped away. But like Roman, they hold on to hope, believing that their stories deserve to be heard and that justice can prevail. By supporting the causes of freedom and human rights, we honor not only Roman's fight, but the fight of every individual who dares to stand against oppression. We have the power to support these causes, to speak out, to spread awareness, to demand accountability for those who abuse their power. Let Roman's journey inspire us to stand with those who are silenced, to amplify the voices of those still in the shadows, and to carry forward the mission he has dedicated his life to. Together, we can build a world where justice and human dignity prevail, a world that ensures no voice is ever lost to fear or injustice. Roman has shown us what courage looks like, and now it's our turn. Let's join the fight for freedom, for justice, and for human rights everywhere. Let's ensure that his sacrifice, and the sacrifices of countless others, are not in vain. The fight continues, and with our support, it can grow stronger.